Welcome to our session number 3 on our conference, Return of Inflation. We now have the title for this session, Climate Change, Climate Protection and Inflation. Let me update the title of our session on the fly. I think energy crisis should also be in the title. And we are facing now 3 main components which our speakers will put into relationship, which is on the one hand climate change, on the other hand the full-blown energy price crisis we are in and the impact on inflation, but also the reverse effect from inflation on climate change, for instance. I do have a wonderful panel of 3 women and 1 man. Today the gender balance is different. From 3 policy-making institutions and from one BlackRock, which will give us the market perspective. I would like to start to introduce Blandine Barreau. She's already online from Paris, if I understand correctly. Hi Blandine, nice to see you. She's the coordinator of the World Energy Outlook and working for the International Energy Agency in Paris. I know that she will put a lot of focus on the energy crisis. Elga, on my right side, comes from BlackRock, as I said, has 20 years of macro research experience and will give us the market perspective. Luiz represents the OECD. He's a specialist on structural policy surveillance, and he will talk about progress on decarbonization and the effect of decarbonization on economic performance. Last but not least, on my left side, Christiane from ECB. ECB always gets the hottest seat right now, and she will give us very interesting insights into the development, into the correlation and the relationship between climate change and climate mitigation policies and inflation, and also making a very nice differentiation between short run and long run. So we will have interesting insights. I have really asked speakers to stick to the 10 minutes, which will reserve an active interactive chance to participate in the discussion. So prepare your questions, please. And as a teaser, before handing over to Blandine, I just say that we in the OeNB, we have published a piece of research which shows that the inflation impact of 2 serious decarbonization policy measures are very moderate, very benign for Austria. The EU emission trading system has no significant effect on inflation because Austria profits from a high share of renewable energy. And also for the carbon tax, which is going to start this year and which we have simulated, only an effect of 0.1 to 0.2 percentage points annually can be simulated on the inflation rate. So I know that Austria is probably not very representative here, and I just put it as a teaser into the discussion to see whether I get a lot of other views. Blandine, the floor is yours. We look forward to your outlook.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind invitation today. I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. Just a very basic question. Should I be sharing my presentation or
yes,
would you run? Okay. All right. So if you could bear with me for a second while I do that. Obviously, I remember.
Please go ahead, Blandine. We can see your slides.
Thank you. Excellent. So I think you've planted the scene. You've given us a state of play, which is already prevailing. So I won't spend too much time. If you could go kindly to the next slide, please. Yeah, so again, just a few stylus facts about the situation we are in. And thanks again for having made room for the issue of climate change and clean energy transitions in this very interesting conference. So again, just to share, a broad state of play of where we're standing and what policymakers have to deal with. So obviously, we are in the middle of this huge energy and commodity price shock. As of the end of last month, the prices for fossil fuels have risen by 3 to 7 times compared to levels seen in October 20. That is unprecedented. The prices of critical minerals, those minerals that are so indispensable to clean energy technologies, have also soared. The price of lithium itself is nearly 9 times what it was in October 20. And this, as well as food price inflation, is driving a massive inflationary shock that is being felt around the world, particularly in emerging markets in developing economies, where food and fuel occupy such a larger share of the average consumption basket. So it is therefore important, and more important than ever, to promote energy transitions in order to be able to reconcile decarbonization with energy security and affordability. And I hope to be conveying that in a few minutes I have right now. Next slide, please. Why is it of critical importance to accelerate clean energy transitions in this crisis context? Well, it's because only well-managed transitions will offer a sustainable shelter from price volatility. The IEA has been looking specifically at how a price spike in oil and gas would affect households in the future in different scenarios. And well, let's get this right, and let's get what is on this slide right. Obviously, the situation in terms of energy consumption and affordability varies widely from country to country. But what we have here is an average global household and a situation where roughly half of the energy bills are on oil products, mainly petrol for cars. So in this situation, around 1/3 of the average household budget is to pay for electricity, appliances, air conditioners, and so on. In our, you have the full slide. In our stated policy scenario, which encompasses current targets by countries, current policies, we have, in the case of a price shock, the average household energy bill rising by 15% by 2030. Sorry, that is not in the case of a price shock. That is like the tendency, the trajectory. But if we're looking at the net zero, at what happens in the net zero world by 2050, we have energy bills actually falling by nearly 10%. Reason has to do with energy efficiency, electrification of mobility, so lower budget dedicated to petrol for cars again, and finally lower average prices for oil and gas, because in this net zero scenario, we have lower demand for, again, oil and gas. Now, looking at what happens if we shock these systems with a spike in oil and gas prices, what you have on the right-hand side, well, in a situation where our clean energy transitions have collectively accelerated to reach net zero emissions by 2050, this price shock would be actually 30% less costly to households in a net zero world, compared to a world that we would reach with the trajectory and the policies that are implemented right now. As always, there is no free lunch. These benefits won't come for free. They require a significant amount of additional investment in the meantime in new low emission equipment, electric cars, efficient retrofits, and so on. So all very cost-effective solutions, but many households, especially poorer ones, will require help from governments to manage the upfront cost. And I'll get deeper into the, the investment challenge with the next slide, please. So zooming on this specific investment challenge, still from a global perspective, the challenge again is to bridge the gap between the newly announced, the currently announced net zero pledges and a net zero emission world. And the IEA analysis points to the fact that the pathway to net zero is narrow, but still feasible. We are around 13 gigaton away from a global net zero trajectory, but there is a big caveat, which is that these 13 gigaton emission reductions need to happen in the decade, need to happen by 2030. So one precondition to this decade challenge is to obviously deploy available commercially viable technologies, which is good news to know that we have the necessary technologies at the ready. So first and foremost, the electricity sector needs to get to net zero by the end of the decade, thanks to a huge push in solar and wind in our scenarios. Once this electricity generation is clean, then it will enable consumers to use it in their homes, in their cars, and thus accelerate decarbonization. And the other big push that we need to make collectively in this decade is in energy efficiency, obviously. I won't, go into much details in terms of the technical challenges. Happy to take any questions you may have on this topic afterwards, obviously. But first and foremost, this means that we need a substantial scale up in clean energy investment. And to be very concrete about the amounts that are at play here, the IEA estimates that over the last few years, you have roughly $1 trillion that has been invested on clean energy technologies each year. This is an amount that has been already stable, roughly evenly split between advanced and emerging markets and developing economies, which is already an imbalance. If you think that emerging markets and developing economies account for around 60% of all energy demand, and this is an imbalance that we need to solve. And still looking at what needs to happen by 2030, we need to collectively, again, at the global level, to invest almost double the amount that we are seeing now. And we need investment in clean energy to rise to almost $4 trillion. With 70% of this difference between the current level and the $4 trillion by 2030, absolutely necessary to happen in emerging markets and developing economies. Because in the net zero world, these economies, these main global players that are not advanced economies, make up for almost 60% of clean energy investment, which is far more in line with the role they will have, with the fact that they represent 2/3 of the share of the global energy demand. So again, most of this clean energy investment obviously comes from the private sector, but we need to attract it first and foremost in EMDEs and international catalysts, something to accelerate flows of capital in support of energy transitions in these geographies and allow developing economies to chart a new lower emission path of development. If we can go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to give you a flavor, spend a minute or two on what is currently happening, having in mind what we are advocating for the future. And again, this slide is looking at a crucial but partial aspect of the challenge, which is public spending. Because at the G20 leaders' request, the IEA has been monitoring the content of national recovery plans that were enacted in response to the pandemic to appraise how much of what government disbursed will effectively contribute to put us on the path to net zero. And what we are seeing is that government recovery spending for clean energy clearly is reaching new heights, growing to $710 billion, in total from what we appraise as of now. And just to give you a sense of perspective, this is equivalent, this is like far higher than what governments disbursed in reaction to the global financial crisis for clean energy and in terms like broad terms, in broad green spending terms. And this is almost 40% higher than the green spending included in a 2008 to 10 response by government to the global financial crisis. And around 60% of this $710 billion is meant to be disbursed during the critical recovery period out to 2023, and it has the potential to mobilize additional investments amounting to $1.6 trillion, which is huge, and which is also 3/4 of what we appraise is needed by 2023, very short term, to keep on track with net zero by 2050. So that's an encouraging broad picture. But, reminding, having in mind what I said before in terms of the imbalance to correct between emerging and developing economies and advanced economies, we again see that everything is not done in the right sense of the term. We still see a striking imbalance between OECD countries and these EMDEs, emerging and developing economies, with EMDEs marking 10 times less spending than the OECD countries for sustainable recovery, and less than a quarter of what is needed in the short term in our net zero scenario in terms of public spending. A lot of explanations behind this discrepancy. First and foremost, it has to do with the difference in fiscal leeways between these different categories of countries. And that is something we need to work collectively on to solve again in the current decade. Something else, and another message for governments that the IEA has been passing along a lot is that if we want this government spending, this government recovery spending to find its way to the real economy and realize its full potential, we need to accelerate on implementation. We need to address the current disturbances in international trade. Governments need to set up the adequate programs, notably for innovation-related spending plans, to channel this enormous amount of clean energy spending, and notably for consumer-facing spending, these subsidies for retrofits, appliances. Consumers are often not so well aware of what is existing, and administrative processes are also oftentimes quite heavy. So governments probably need to flexibilize all this to again ensure that their initial public spending will have the Keynesian impact they're foreseeing it to have. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we've seen what we deem necessary in terms of challenge to tackle. We've also seen what was happening on government side. I just wanted to finish this introduction with two slides on the encompassing recent IEA recommendations to governments. Governments we're seeing are enacting in response again to the energy price crisis some enormous amount of affordability support in favor of consumers. Since the start of the heating season in the Northern Hemisphere since September last year, governments have more or less earmarked 270 billion for consumer support in subsidies, in price regulation, and so far and so forth. So there is absolutely no questioning this emergency support is indispensable, but the question is rather whether governments are taking long-term steps, in the appropriate way. And in this regard, the IEA has been putting together very early in the energy price crisis a 10-point plan to reduce the European Union reliance on Russian natural gas. And well, again, happy to answer any question you may have on the content of this plan. You see that many measures are spelled out to reduce this reliance on Russian natural gas by over a third. And I just wanted to stress that all these actions were also in line with the European Green Deal and its Fit for 55 package, paving the way for further emission reductions in the year to come. So again, let's not oppose clean energy transitions and response to the current energy price crisis. And I'll finish maybe with a very last slide to also point out that we have a 10-point plan for oil, which aims at presenting immediate actions for advanced economies to cut oil demand in the next 4 months, to reduce the risk of a damaging supply crunch. So with all these tools and with a long-term perspective on what the clean energy transitions need to achieve again in this decade, I just wanted to close with what I hope was a key takeaway here, which is there are many, many ways to respond to the current energy crisis that can also bring us to a cleaner and more secure energy future. And we do not need to choose between solving the energy crisis or the climate one, but rather we cannot afford collectively to ignore either of these objectives. And with that, I'm very eager to hear other speakers, and I stand ready for any question the audience or the panel may have at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Merci, Blandine. Thank you. I would like to hand over to Mrs. Bartsch. Elga, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So from a market perspective, there are a number of points that I would like to make on this important debate about inflation and climate change. So first of all, I think we have already entered a new higher inflation regime. That's already pretty clear. I think what is also clear is that the world is much more than it has been in the past, shaped by supply shifts. We discussed this yesterday as well. And climate change is just a further aspect in this respect, and one that will stay with us for a long time, both in terms of the transition, but also in terms of climate change itself. And the world shaped by supply brings two key points. One is it's in overall constraints on the supply side, puts inflation pressure, but it also will likely require very material shifts between sectors. And in order to accommodate those, we need much more relative price changes than we might have had in the past. And as the world is shaped by supply, it also will likely bring more macro volatility, more output volatility, because the so-called divine coincidence that by pursuing an inflation target or price stability objective, you also achieve stability of output and of the financial sector, could be challenged. And this could mean that we need to think and discuss central bank inflation targeting frameworks, and that will eventually have very material repercussions for the policy landscape, and as a result also for the market landscape. And there is in particular a number of concerns that stand out from a market perspective. First of all is the shift in the inflation dynamics longer term. Secondly, the higher volatility, and the fact that with more supply side constraints, you have much more pronounced trade-off that central banks have to manage. And to disentangle between supply and demand shocks is not easy either. So as a result, you also have a higher risk of policy errors. And all of that challenges even more than the effective lower bound already did, the role of government bonds as safe assets in the financial system and in financial markets. So you have higher inflation against which nominal government bonds don't offer much protection. You also have government bonds struggling to provide an offset in situations where you have a sell-off in risk asset markets. And in the extreme, you could have the negative correlation between risk assets and government bonds that is at the heart of a lot of risk management notions be challenged. So let me just unpack a couple of these points. So first of all, a new inflation regime. That's in part rang in by new central bank policy frameworks, but we also have seen the post-pandemic activity restart really giving us a first glimpse of how powerful these sort of bottlenecks that emerge on the supply side can be, even in a situation where activity has not yet fully recovered to the pre-pandemic trend. So that's where you have major sectoral shifts, and in order to make them happen in market economies, you obviously need major moves in relative prices, and as prices find it easier to rise than to fall, you have inflation pressure. And I think there are good arguments for central banks to look through some of these inflation pressures that are generated by these sectoral shifts. But when it comes to climate change, obviously, we have the desire to facilitate a lot of resource reallocation, and we want a shift towards a low-carbon economy, and we want it quickly. And I think what we need to remember in this context is that what we are fundamentally doing is to reflect external costs, i.e. the costs of climate change in economic decisions. And yes, depending on how exactly they're reflected, this will likely have an impact on overall inflation. And the estimates, and I think Christiane will talk to that, vary widely of how much inflation this could potentially generate, depending on how high a carbon price you assume, what time frame you have in mind, and a whole host of other policies that might accompany the transition, but not including climate change in these in our economic decisions day to day will also have an inflationary impact, because climate change itself will eventually be a major negative supply shock. And that means you have reduced crop yields, you have higher food price inflation, you have a higher frequency of weather-related disasters, resulting bottlenecks in global supply chains as a result of that, average rising temperature weighing on labor productivity. So all in all, climate change as well as climate protection or steps towards climate protection will cause higher inflation. It will also likely cause more volatile inflation, especially if we leave it too late and we end up with a disorderly transition, or indeed if we let climate change run in an unmitigated fashion. And so that's, I think, while we have a new inflation regime. Now, why is it so important that it's a world shaped by supply? So for me, that's really a key debate, much more important to have than whether the long-term impact on inflation is 20, 30, or 40 basis points. But once we have a world that is shaped by supply shocks rather than demand shocks, monetary policy can no longer stabilize inflation and activity at the same time. And that's a major challenge, because a particular inflation targeting policy framework rests on that assumption that that one target helps you to achieve other goals as well. And so central banks will have to choose between controlling inflation and stabilizing growth. And that higher volatility that this will create should imply that central banks are more likely to tolerate some inflation, not talking about the inflation that we're seeing at the moment, but some higher inflation than in the past. But it's not just the overall macroeconomic constraints, but it's also the very important sectoral shifts that I already mentioned. And these bottlenecks, which in the case of the climate transition are policy induced because we want the resources to allocate towards renewable energy, for instance. So the transition to net zero will materially reinforce those sectoral shifts. And again, as you have these sectoral shifts, and in particular if they are due to a socially and politically desirable or mandated, legitimized policy, central banks should help to accommodate some of that transition. And they could or would make it a lot harder if they stepped on the brakes to stamp out inflation. So again, another argument why central banks might tolerate more inflation. So what does this mean for central bank policy frameworks? That's an important anchor for financial markets in terms of forming expectations about how policymakers will react to this. So first of all, pursuing price stability as the only goal of monetary policy might bring with it greater output and market volatility that might not be desirable anymore. and might warrant a discussion. Secondly, I think an empirical evaluation as to whether the existing inflation targets are actually providing sufficient room for the relative price adjustments that we're trying to engineer with the transition to net zero might be warranted. The ECB has done in-depth work at this back in 2003. Maybe it's worth sort of looking at this question again. And that doesn't mean that I would be in favor of adjusting inflation targets, but to just know how tight the room for maneuver for relative price changes is I think, something that would be very interesting to know. And then last but not least, a strict application of average inflation targeting or price level targeting, of course, would likely lead to an excessively tight monetary policy if we have a considerable part of inflation that is driven by supply shocks. So a flexible interpretation, like the one that the ECB has adopted, is warranted. So from the market point of view, to sum up, sort of we are entering, I think, a new regime, a new era of higher inflation, of inflation that is driven by supply for a number of reasons. Climate change is one, demography could be another, but there are more, and we've got a taster of that with the post-pandemic activity restart. This is very challenging for central banks, for central bank frameworks, and it brings with it a greater risk of policy errors. But again, from a financial market point of view, it really could question the status of government bonds, especially long-dated government bonds, as safe assets. And it could also affect cross-asset correlation. So in the light of a new inflation regime, and with central banks potentially being forced to act more forcefully, investors increasingly are starting to question the perceived safety of government bonds. As inflation protection, that's very limited for nominal government bonds, if none at all. But also in terms of whether they provide the right amount of offset against sell-offs in risk assets. And so faced with higher inflation, higher interest rate volatility, the term premium could likely decompress even further, driving bond yields higher. And as a result, if we end up with markets falling, really starting to embrace the idea that we might be having a situation of stagflation, then you could even see cross-asset correlations being challenged. So for financial markets, this is a very important debate, and really not just in the near term, but also for long-term investors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elga. Not very comforting views. Luiz de Mello, can I hand over to you? And please share your slides.
Absolutely, Birgit. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. We can hear you. And can you please share your slides?
Absolutely. I'll do that straight away. But just to start off with, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you today. I hope you can see the slides.
Yes, we do.
Okay. I'm trying to put them in slideshow so that you have a better view from where you're sitting. So I think we heard a lot of very interesting points from Blandine and from Elga. I'll touch on some of them, and hopefully in doing so I'll be able to add some fresh insights here. Let me, I think you can see now the split screen, or can you see just one screen?
We can see the future slide as well.
Okay, so let me try to, and now?
No, still 2 slides to be seen.
Still 2 slides.
But we can share it for you as well, Mr.
Now it's okay.
Yeah? Okay.
Now it's okay.
That's okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's always a little lag, so I'm glad I'm glad that Paris and Vienna are not that far away because the lag would be even longer, but I'm glad it works now. So I just thought, Birgit, that I would focus on two main questions here. That one is basically to set the scene, how far decarbonization has gone, how far we are from the targets, and then the effects of policies, essentially climate change mitigation and environmental policies on performance. I think that this first slide will not be new to Blandine, for instance, because I'm borrowing the IEA scenarios that she already talked about, just to illustrate the fact that we're still pretty far from achieving the targets, the emissions targets that are needed to meet the climate change goals. Some countries are further from that target than others. So just to make the point that I'm sure has come up already in the discussions of how far we are still, how much work there is ahead of us. At the OECD, we tried to gauge the strictness of environmental policies across countries by using an indicator basically that focuses on climate, energy, and air pollution policies, so a subset of environmental policies more broadly, the ones that have an immediate impact on climate change, and covering a wide variety of countries, basically to see how they are doing in terms of the policies that are in place. We can see that over the years, if you compare the bars and the diamonds here in the chart, that the bars are typically higher than the diamonds, so there has been a lot of progress over the last 20 years in environmental policies in a number of countries. And why is it important to have an idea of the environmental policies in different countries? Is because essentially it affects economic performance. And I'm making this point because we just heard from Elga how important it will be to think about, in the long term, about the supply side implications of the transformations that we need to happen to ensure that we meet the agreed climate change targets. And what we find basically in our analysis is a point that you made yourself, Birgit, that on average, impacts as you tighten policies, if you raise standards of environmental protection, the impact on performance in terms of growth, in terms of employment, in terms of a host of other indicators, on average tends to be relatively small, so it tends to be manageable. But we need to bear in mind that they are very heterogeneous across sectors. And that's what you can see in this chart. If you look at trade performance, exports, or trade in general, between countries with different levels of environmental standards, if we look at foreign direct investment, for instance, we see that average impacts are small, but they differ between high pollution and low pollution intensity firms. So this is micro disaggregated data, obviously at the firm level. And there I'm making this point essentially to say that even if average impacts are small, we need to look at how it affects sectors and firms differently, depending on their level or their environmental credentials, if you want, if they're operating sectors that are more polluting or less polluting, if they are operating closer to the technological frontier or not, precisely for the reasons that Elga mentioned, that we are talking essentially over time about facilitating reallocation of capital and labor, of resources across the different sectors of our economy towards those sectors that are greener, that are less polluting, and that can then drive growth and productivity over time. What we wanted to reduce pressure on prices is that this reallocation is as smooth as possible towards sectors that are consistent with attainment of the climate change targets, towards increasing productivity, so that the potential growth of our economies, or potential output rather of our economies, can be as high as possible, so that we avoid mismatches of demand and supply moving forward. So I've already made this point. So, with this insight, so this point about reallocation, an important one if we're going to look at the long term about the supply side of our economies. A word about the war in Ukraine and the implication that that has had for energy prices. I think we heard already from Blandine about the pressures that the conflict has created. I just wanted to illustrate some of the volatility that we are seeing across different fossil fuels, and obviously to make the point that this has an impact on inflation in the short term. If you look, for example, and this is the changes in producer prices and consumer prices in the OECD area since March, so since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and you can see that the pressure on producer prices has been much higher than the pressure on consumer prices. In the OECD area, on average, about 1/3 of changes in producer prices pass through to consumer prices, so we can expect this type of upward pressure on producer prices that we are seeing now to be reflected down the line in consumer prices as well. So in the short term, some inflationary pressure arising from the very sharp increase in fuel prices. That obviously is different across countries, depending on Europe is particularly vulnerable given the reliance on imports of fuels from Russia. And you can see from the previous slide here, the one in the middle, already this gap between, in gas markets between Europe and the US, for example, given the geopolitical the circumstances of Europe. But this is the shorter term. Let me get back to the longer term as a way also of linking to some of the points that Elga has made. We know that so far that carbon prices account for a relatively small increase in electricity prices, for example. This chart illustrates that clearly that the bulk of what we see in the increase in the level of prices and the volatility comes from other sources, not necessarily carbon pricing. And here I'm borrowing analysis again from the IEA, pointing to a number of supply and demand factors in the short term that have played an important role, not least the strong rebound in demand from the pandemic, issues related to investment in fossil fuel production, insufficient scaling up of clean energy sources over the past few years. Also other very specific issues related to unforeseen maintenance and repair works in the case of LNG plants, some weather-related factors in different parts of the world, pressures associated with storage levels as well. So there is a lot that is happening at the moment that basically reflects supply and demand, not necessarily the price of carbon that is applied in those markets. So in the long term, if we are to basically have a smooth transition towards greener economies, what can we expect in terms of pressures on prices? I think here we need to bear in mind supply and demand factors as well. And what is likely to happen during the transition, what's likely to happen once that transition is achieved. Central to that is obviously the reallocation story that I mentioned a minute ago, that Elga has already mentioned. Issues that have to do with pressures on inflation arising from changes in relative prices. For example, imagine the substitutability that needs to happen between brown technologies and new technologies, frictions that we may observe in global supply chains in the process. So these are obviously issues or factors that that are related to changes in relative prices that will put pressure on inflation readings as well in the process. The same goes for labor shortages in green skills, for example. We are seeing that as a factor that needs to be taken into account. Issues related to how the labor markets will function and how that reallocation will happen on the labor side as well. So the likelihood of frictions that will need to be dealt with, and that can create pressures as we move along this path of of changes in relative prices, for example. But it's also important to bear in mind that once the transition is achieved, what we can expect, especially if that transition is smooth. We can actually, expect lower energy prices, lower energy demand if there is enough investment in energy efficiency moving forward. The point that also we heard from Blandine as part of these investments that are needed in the future. It's also possible that we may end up having more resilient energy supply chains if other issues such as intermittencies is taken care of, lower costs related to climate-related shocks, lower pressure on adaptation investment, for example. So a number of possible scenarios that may point to lower pressures on inflation moving forward. But of course, all that is predicated on a smooth transition. And for that, let me just reiterate the importance of investment here and the importance of innovation, essentially to reduce the cost of those clean technologies that are the ones that will need to be adopted to ensure this smooth path towards a lower carbon economy. What is interesting here that we are seeing that is obviously for innovation to lower the cost of green technologies, well, there has to be some support. There will have to be also changes in the relative prices between clean and dirty technologies. But what we observe over time is that if you pick one indicator of how much innovation is taking place, that essentially there was, a very sharp increase in patent filings in low carbon technologies until about, the middle of last decade, and then there has been a drop since. So it's important to bear in mind that we needed to maintain the momentum of innovation in this area so that, once again, those relative price changes can be as smooth as possible, that reallocation can be also supported by innovation. One final point, and that's my last one, that has to do with investment and policy uncertainty. We've done some work essentially trying to link green investment and investment in general to policy uncertainty. Uncertainty arising, for example, from frequent policy reversals, from changes in policy in countries that tend to lower firm-level investment, especially in those carbon-intensive sectors. So investments in in clean technologies can reduce those price differentials between clean and dirty, but also they need to take place in an environment of greater policy certainty that can encourage then those investments towards this trajectory of a smooth transition moving forward. And I'll stop here, Birgit, but I just thought that by focusing on these longer-term issues, the ones that go beyond what's happening right now, given the dislocations that we are seeing in energy markets, can help us think a bit about the type of changes in relative prices, the type of reallocation that we will need to have, that policy will need to support as a way of delivering the transition that is needed towards a lower carbon economy. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luiz. I'm glad that you showed us some light at the end of the tunnel. And I hand over to Christiane, please.
Thanks a lot. So I also brought some slides. And thanks again also Birgit and colleagues from the Austrian National Bank for inviting me to this very nice conference and also for putting together this very topical panel. While we're putting up the slides, I mean, just to bear in mind that what I show here are, of course, my views and not necessarily the ones by the ECB. But of course, there is some overlap. So, so it's not completely orthogonal. And as said, I brought some slides, and they are mainly there to illustrate a bit the storyline. So it's not so much that I would like to dwell on a particular chart, but just to also show that we have done or tried to do some estimates here, and so that you are aware of also what we are doing. So, I mean, we've already heard that governments and parliaments have the primary responsibility to act upon climate change. But of course, the ECB has recognized in its strategy review that there is a need to further incorporate climate change into its policy framework. And this we have done, as said, in the strategy review last year. And climate change and policies affect the outlook for price stability through their impact on macroeconomic indicators, through financial stability, and we heard something there already by Elga, and the transmission of monetary policy. Now, both climate change and its mitigation can impact relative prices and inflation, and we will look into that in my presentation. And climate change shocks, especially if materializing in form of simultaneous extreme events and compound risk, and that we've also seen that namely climate change shocks plus then other shocks can add upon each other, they prove actually increasingly difficult to react to. And the transition may add pressure on inflation, but there is uncertainty about magnitude and timing, and these pressures are likely to ease or even reverse in the longer run. Now, as said, the focus here in my presentation will be on inflation, and in some sense, we made our life a little bit more easy in this presentation, because we basically assumed that we would indeed go ahead with this net zero economy until 2050, like it's also, for example, planned in the Fit for 55 package. So now, first of all, and we've seen that already, I would like to say that these energy markets are already under pressure from the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And we've seen that there are bottlenecks, and we had the supply side, especially mentioned also by Elga. We have had a recovery after the pandemic, and that is adding on then on the war in Ukraine. And what we have seen is that we have basically, and this is my chart on the left-hand side, basically energy prices, wholesale prices above historic values. And what we also see with the dotted lines, that they are most likely here to stay for a longer period. Now, on the right-hand side, we see what this has meant for inflation in the euro area for HICP. And what we've see here is that indeed, you know, the large increase that we've seen in inflation in the recent months has been driven by the increases of fuel, gas, and electricity. And what is maybe a new thing is indeed that we have seen these increases in particular also from gas and from electricity prices. Now, while the increase in crude oil prices, we've seen that of similar magnitude in the past, the increase in the consumer energy prices, this is indeed unprecedented, and that we have not seen before. And as said, this is also because we have these increases in particular in gas and also electricity prices. Now, if we are looking at what is going on with carbon prices and what is the impact that it has currently on inflation, now on the left-hand side, on the one hand, we can say, yes, carbon prices under the EU emission trading system have increased since 2021. You see that there have been also, these are the yellow bars, quite some, let's say, increases or price changes in 2021. However, if you look at how much of the EU emissions are covered by ETS. You see at the moment it's only these blue bars, it's around 40% are only covered, and the rest, basically the yellow bars, is only partially covered also by national measures. And we've heard also the study from the Austrian Central Bank that these national measures, most likely taken together, the impact on electricity prices has so far been relatively limited. But electricity prices have risen because this was basically this increase in ETS prices was overshadowed by the increases in gas prices, and that again was related mostly due to the war in Ukraine and the recovery from the pandemic. Now, in my next slide, what we have tried to do is indeed this trying to look a bit into the future. What does all of this mean for future price developments? And on the left-hand side, you see some model simulations that we have done also in the context of our forecast exercise, where we have assumed that we would indeed have this gradual and linear increase of carbon taxes that are also foreseen under, for example, this Fit for 55 package. And when we would have that in order to move in 2050 to a net zero environment, then we would actually see, and that is sort of what you see, a gradual carbon pricing, so this slight increase over time of this effective carbon tax rates would mean that we have an impact on overall inflation of around 0.15 percentage points. This is, on the one hand, the direct pass-through of energy costs to household. On the other hand, there are also this indirect pass-through, that is, these are the blue bars. But if we were to assume that we would even push ahead and be much quicker, then of course we would also have a higher impact on inflation of around 0.4 percentage points already in the coming years. But we've also heard from the presentation by our colleague from the OECD that it's not very likely that we would actually speed ahead much. The more, let's say, benign scenario seems to be more likely, but this is, as said, only concentrating on these carbon taxes. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, this is a different study. It's basically a survey that we conduct. It's the corporate telephone survey, where in the last round, which was just finished and where we will also publish the results soon after this presentation, where we actually asked 90 corporates about how they think climate change and climate change policies, how they think it would affect input costs and selling prices. And there, indeed, we asked particularly the question, what is happening now, what is happening during the transition, and what is happening following the transition, and that both for, let's say, input costs and for selling prices. And the result is, of these survey results, is that indeed, let's say, until now or during the transition, they see that there is a significant increase or a slight increase of both input costs and selling prices. However, following the transition, this impact gets much lower, and even there are some more respondents who say that there is no impact at all. And so, let's say, going forward, we have to really differentiate between what will go on until maybe 2030 and what will happen afterwards. Now, looking even further ahead into the future, and that was also basically also said by the colleague from the OECD, that this successful transition may lead to downward pressures on inflation in the long run. And what I show on the left-hand side is that we look here at the projected energy consumption and the mix in the EU. And what we see here, if we were to go ahead with the plans that, for example, we have under the Fit for 55 package, where we say that renewable energy should be around 40% by 2030, then indeed, and then going forward to 2050, around 80% of our energy consumption would be basically made up by renewable energy. So fossil fuels, the blue bars, get smaller and smaller, and overall, let's say, energy consumption will also go down. Now, the interesting thing is, and that is the right-hand side, and it shows basically the current data, the costs for renewables. The costs for renewables have come down quite tremendously in the last 20 years. And already now, often their costs are lower than the ones of fossil fuels. And this trend most likely is also going to continue. But at the moment, we can also say that gas prices are playing a large role for electricity prices and de facto determine electricity prices. By 2030, and if we go ahead with the Fit for 55 package, or also now this Repower EU, then by 2030, renewable energy prices should drive electricity prices. And there, indeed, if that was to happen, we would actually have a downward impact on inflation. Now, this is my final slide. Many thanks. Just to say, to wrap up, in the transition to a net zero environment, most likely we will see these pressures on prices. There is, of course, a large uncertainty about the precise effect and timing, also because we don't know how quickly governments will push through with these measures. And after the transition, there is an increased share of renewables, and that may mean lower energy prices, in particular for electricity. So thank you very much. And
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christiane. I think we have some disagreements and some agreements in the panel. I would say that there is a strong agreement that we need investment and innovation, which will make the transition easier. There is no agreement on how volatile the transition will be. I think your viewpoint was outstanding. But there is quite some consensus that if we manage the transition, we will face a brighter world with more energy security and less sensitivity and less proneness to shocks, because we have become more independent. As we only have 10 minutes left for this panel, I will look into the room whether there are any questions, and I also ask Ernest whether something is happening in the chat. Ernest, if I think...
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
There is a question by Pierre Monin, and the question is, in which scenario would central banks be more able to manage inflation, hothouse world, or a world that has transitioned to low carbon? If it is the latter, shouldn't central banks actively support the transition to end up in a more comfortable situation for them in terms of inflation management? I think this question goes to Christiane, maybe also to Elga.
Yeah. Now, let's put it this way. I mean, the ECB has already moved de facto into trying to incorporate, let's say, this low carbon world and trying to foster also the transition to let's say, a greener environment. So in that sense, I think we, with the strategy review, have already kind of made up our mind. So we're moving indeed into this direction, and also because we are considering not just, let's say, monetary policy, but also, let's say, the wider aspects of what it means for all of us if we are not, or if we continue living, let's say, in a hothouse environment. So having that said, I mean, there's still a lot of work from our side to be done, and we are just, let's say, also kind of in the very early stages. I mean, I showed you some, for example, some calculations that we have done. We are at the moment equipping all our models, trying to kind of being able, for example, to model this investment impacts that we would have, the impact also then more widely on GDP, and also basically to have more of a general equilibrium model behind all these measures. And so indeed, you know, let's say a low carbon world is something that indeed we are aiming for let's say many reasons, and not just, let's say, for monetary policy reasons.
Yeah, so I agree, and I think the question seems to refer to the NGFS definitions of the various scenarios, and I think the hothouse scenario, i.e. unmitigated climate change, will eventually be very inflationary and lead to a great deal of volatility, and is eventually the biggest negative supply shock of them all. A belated disorderly transition could also be causing pretty material inflation impact as well as volatility, whereas an early move towards an early and credible transition is in the long run, the least inflationary one. And as a result, I think central banks everywhere, but in particular the ECB, are sort of embracing this as a new factor to build into their forecasting work, their policy frameworks, and a lot of other aspects of their work.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Can I take a question from the present audience?
Thank you. I have a question to Blandine. You said in your slides, Action 2 is to replace existing contracts, but I think most of them, they are long-term contracts. How should this be done?
Maybe we can take the next question immediately, and I would like to take another third question, and then we'll ask the panel.
Okay, I have a question for Luiz de Mello from the OECD. So you showed this graph about this explosion essentially, and then this bust in patent in low carbon patents. And I was interested in knowing more about what drives this kind of evolution over the last couple of years, and how this graph looks like now. Actually, it would also be an update. Would be nice.
Yes, please. Let's take the two, and then, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Laurent Mélichet from the JVI. I have a question for Blandine also. You showed the overall need for investment in energy systems over the next, I think, 8 years or so. And then a couple of slides later, you showed the needs of public investment, but over a different time frame. I was wondering, overall, how are the two projected till 2030? What's the need for public investment until 2030 as a fraction of overall investment? And how do you quickly sort of come to that figure?
Thank you. And the very last question, the gentleman here.
Yes, the price of lithium was mentioned, and perhaps more forward-looking point, how concerned should we be that achieving this energy transition will require will end up creating much higher prices for necessary raw materials for these new technologies? And is this going to be another inflationary source?
Thank you for this statement. I'm going to ask our two virtual speakers in Paris to close off, because all the questions have gone to you, if this is fine of you. Luiz, please, can you go first, and then Blandine as the last one. Thank you.
Thanks, Birgit, and thanks for the question. Now, indeed, the chart on patent filings is very impressive, because you see that hump-shaped curve. A lot of you see that the level that we have, the latest data point is essentially close to the average that we had before that increase in the first half of the last decade, and a lot of that was associated with the investment drive after in the recovery phase from the global financial crisis. So, if you expect in the current recovery now, the importance of investment and support for investment that is taking place. So, one optimistic reading of the chart is that we can expect an increase take up of patent filings of innovation in that area as well. So that's what we're hoping to see. And if you allow me, Birgit, just one very short comment on the point that Pierre mentioned in the chart that I think is a very important one. We don't tend to emphasize enough the costs of inaction in this area. And inaction would go straight to the point that we were all making before about the need to sustain supply, to work on the supply side of our economies during the transition. Part of the cost of inaction is the revenue, is the output foregone in the case of more frequent and more serious natural disasters moving forward, issues related to spending on adaptation that will be required if we live in a world of more frequent again and more serious natural disasters associated with climate change. So I think that having a good grasp of that cost of inaction will help us make the case for action by central banks, as was already mentioned by Christiane and Elga, but also everything else that is needed, support for innovation, policy certainty, the points that I made before, but also, the whole panoply of policy support that will be needed to engineer that smooth, orderly transition that would be consistent with the benign scenario also that we presented for the longer term. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for saying this very fundamental and important point. Yeah. Blandine, the last 2 minutes are with you.
Thank you. I'll take the question on contracts and then the one on lithium. And if you could kindly, come back to the one on public investment, because I'm not sure I quite, understood, what was at stake. But first, let me answer to that contracts question. So indeed, gas supply contracts are long-term. What the IEA is saying in its 10-point plan is no new gas supply contract with Russia. And also it's calling the EU members to take on what the opportunity that expiring gas import contracts with Gazprom are providing. So some of them are expiring by the end of this year, others by the end of the decade. I don't, you'll have to forgive me. I don't have the exact percentage in mind, but it's between 10 and 15% of the sales of Gazprom towards Europe that is set to expire by the end of 2022. So it's by no means menial. And so again, we're calling on to explore this window of opportunity here that is available. On lithium, a very good comment by the gentleman in the audience. Yes, it's a big issue, and it's an issue the IEA has long identified. One of my colleagues who's leading the work on critical minerals recently put out a paper which I would encourage you to have a look at, depicting how the current market conditions for critical minerals are in fact threatening to revert decades of progress on clean transitions, notably renewables. So the IEA in its last ministerial meeting last month, or a month ago, let's say it was in May, was clearly tasked by its members to, in a way, enlarge this concept of energy security that is at the center, at the core of its mandate since its creation, to this topic of critical minerals. Because the future of energy and the future of energy security also lies with critical mineral supply. And if I could kindly ask you to maybe some of the question on investment,
The question was about the consistency between two slides in your presentation, but as we have run out of time, I'll put you in contact with the person asking. It's about spending overall, spending needs overall, and public spending on slide 8. I'll do this bilaterally.
With pleasure.
And
if I could just add, what I presented in terms of recovery plans was related to direct government spending. That maybe have been the point. Whereas the beginning of the presentation were overall energy investment from public, including government, and private sector. So this may be a discrepancy you're referring to.
Yes, we'll clarify this. I thank you very much also for the, really for both parties of my panel, for the ones who took the effort to come to Vienna, for the ones who took the effort to do it via computer and via virtual access again. I think it worked quite well. I thank also the audience for your attention, and goodbye. I think I give over now to a lecture from Clemens Jobst. This is the next point. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the SUERF Marjolin lecture. So this is the biannual big event of SUERF, and we have the honor today to have here with us one of the world's leading financial historians, Harold James. Harold James is Claude and Laura Kelly Professor in European Studies at Princeton University. He is also Professor of History and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School. Harold James was awarded several prizes for his work, notably the Helmut Schmidt Prize and the Ludwig Erhard Prize. He is a very prolific writer, author of a long list of books on a wide range of topics. I will just cite some of the most recent ones. In 2016 appeared The Euro and the Battle of Economic Ideas. It was a joint work with Markus Brunnermeier and Jean-Pierre Landau. And just 2 years ago, A History of the Bank of England from 1979 to 2003. The title of the lecture today is Inflation and Globalization. And the process of globalization is a long-run interest in the work of Harold James. And it's a work that which I think exemplifies very well how fruitful the dialogue between current debates and history can be in both directions. History provides new perspectives on present issues, but at the same time, it's also the present issues that motivate new questions that we can pose to the past. So the things that we live now also lead us to reinterpret or to find new lessons from the past. And Harold has already published 2 books on, or at least 2, I would like to say 2 books from this long-run interest on globalization. The first one is The End of Globalization from 2001. It was back then, it was kind of motivated by the East Asian crisis, and he took a look back at the factors which lay behind the breakdown of globalization in the interwar period, when global trade and global financial integration declined significantly. In 2009, he took a kind of a reverse perspective. The title of the book was The Creation and Destruction of Values, the Globalization Cycle. And here it was an account of the 2008 financial crisis from the angle of the events that shook the world in 1931. So looking the past to take a new perspective on the present. So today we will have the chance to get a preview of a book which is in the making, as I understood, and which will come out next year? Next year? Okay. So we're very much looking forward to this preview, and please go for the lecture.
Well, thank you so much, Clemens. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you, Ernest, and thank you, everybody at the Austrian National Bank. It's been a wonderful conference. It's a slight embarrassment, obviously, because I wrote a manuscript for this lecture, but many things in the manuscript have already been anticipated by many of the wonderful comments and presentations that we've had already, and particularly, actually, the last panel was, I think, very striking in this regard. And I'm going to take up, if I may, some of the themes that were presented in the last panel, but in a longer-term historical context. And at the beginning of the conference, right at the beginning of the conference, Governor Holtzman said it was a pity that the members of the ECB Council were so young and that they didn't remember the world of the 1970s. So I was born in 1956, and the first year of my studies in Cambridge University was a year in 1975 when the CPI inflation in the UK was just under 25%. So it was an amazing year, and I sort of felt that inflation was, as it were, in my genetic environment. You know, I think a suggestion is, since I don't think it's probably a good idea that all the members of the ECB Council should be between 65 and 80, I think the better solution would be that they read history books. Indeed, you know, there's no member of the ECB Council, obviously, who is 180 years old or 200 years old. And some of the things that I want to talk about are really deep back in the 19th century. But let me begin. I need to find the clicker somewhere to move through these slides. It's here. Let me begin with thinking this is the lecture in honor of the great economist and civil servant and politician Robert Marjolin, who already from a very early age worked with General de Gaulle in London. But I think we can also think of him as one of the people who made the European Monetary Union, in the sense that there are very many documents with rather off-putting titles that actually are much more interesting than their off-putting titles. And this action plan for the second phase of the community, that's a kind of typical bureaucratic phrase that comes from Brussels, but that actually is the plan that started the coordination of central banks and created a particular mechanism for the coordination of central banks in the European Economic Community as it was then, and in a sense produces a dynamic that leads on in the 1970s and 80s to the European monetary system and to the Delors report and to the Maastricht Conference. And so in a sense, Robert Marjolin is indeed a founder of the euro. In 1975, he looked back and he was deeply upset and traumatized and depressed, and he thought of Europe as going on a kind of backwards movement because of what he described as unfortunate events, lack of political will, and insufficient understanding. Well, it seems to me that we're actually very much in a 1975 moment at the moment, that we feel that we're in a world that might be moving backwards. And some people, there's a lot of discussion. I'm sorry. There's a lot of discussion. You see what happens if you move backwards, you drop your audio. There's a lot of discussion about deglobalization, going backwards. We're thinking of a moment that is, I think, full of tensions and full of worries and anxieties, and what the appropriate policy is, how you analyze it, is just very difficult. But then I think also, and that's what I wanted to conclude with, is a message that is a bit like the message that we had in the panel before, that there is a kind of light at the end of the tunnel in this 1975 moment. And so that's, I think, in part what the purpose of going back in history is. So first of all, let me say that there's a consensus, I think, among both policymakers and academics about inflation, and it's probably worth spelling this out, that inflation is traumatic and undesirable. And it clearly is appropriate, I think, to make this point in Austria. You had a devastating hyperinflation in the aftermath of the First World War. As in Germany, it had a traumatic and long-lasting consequence. It strained, more than strained, broke the political system. I think also you can think, and this is true in a European perspective, I think an important lesson that if you have high levels of inflation in a federal or federal-like system, it creates very, very substantial strains, because people on the margins of the federal system believe that the inflation is being manipulated to the advantage of the center. And you can see that process, I think, more clearly in Germany in the early 1920s and the great hyperinflation after the First World War, that Bavaria or Saxony or the Rhineland thought that inflation was being made by a central bank in Berlin, and they needed to escape from it. In the late stages of the Soviet Union, in the late stages of the Yugoslav Federation, in circumstances of bad inflation, there's also a breaking up. And it's not obviously the only cause of the breakup of the Soviet Union or the breakup of Yugoslavia, but it does enter into it. And in addition, inflation pushes distributional wars. We see it at the moment as well, that there's a suspicion that big corporations have a substantial pricing power and that they're pushing the inflation. Or in the 1970s, there was a suspicion that trade unions were pushing the inflation. So as a result of that, a clear consensus emerged in the 1970s that central banks should deliver price stability, and price stability usually associated with some other goal as well. So in the United States, the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve is in these circumstances, comes about in the Humphrey Hawkins legislation in the 1970s. Low inflation, price stability, and full employment and maximum output. In the European Union, not dissimilar, you also have a goal of price stability, a primary goal of price stability, but also supporting the economic policies in the community. So this is what is under threat at the moment. This is, by the way, what was achieved. This is obvious, we don't need to talk about it, that the last period after the 1980s was very, very successful. It was the period that was described as the governor of the Bank of England, the former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, had this phrase for it, nice, non-inflationary continuing expansion, or some people said nearly competitive international equilibrium. Nice, and you can see also that the advanced economies do it first, but the emerging economies come afterwards. And so we've got a consensus, and we're there. But that is now under threat. It's now under threat in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. It's in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, Putin's war of aggression, for three reasons. Shifts in the labor market, and in energy markets. So you heard yesterday the short statement of this really great book by Charles Goodhart and Manoy Pradhan that tells you this story, that globalization was a process that pushed down the prices. It made a lot of capital available, so it's not just a goods story, it's also a population story, it's a migration story, it's also a capital availability story. But now we're facing a different world. And secondly, and I think really very significantly and quite well explored also in the course of the last couple of days, shifts in relative prices after big technology and supply shocks. And that is really crucial, because the inflation targeting view that you got as a kind of near consensus in the 90s and the 2000s, and that gave the success that we looked at before, that relied on basically no big structural shocks. But when you get structural shocks, relative prices move against each other. And it's very important that everybody sees those prices moving. That's how investment occurs, investment to produce the new solutions. You react to prices. That's how consumer behavior also will react to crises. When consumers see prices going up, they will shift their consumption patterns. And if you try to suppress those prices, you really won't get the reaction, and you will have to wait for much, much longer for the light at the end of the tunnel. And thirdly, and also we've had that mentioned, that this new world challenges the idea that government debt is free from inflation risk. And that was a substantial feature of the last decade in particular, a substantial feature which made it possible for many people to think that governments basically could offer a free lunch, because governments could borrow more cheaply than investors thought that their investments were having a return. And so it makes sense for governments to do all kinds of things. And in the new circumstances, when the cost of government borrowing is much more uncertain, and there are uncertainties in the future, it requires really then an adaptation of the kind that you heard before, which is that governments need to think precisely about how they allocate their expenditure, how they allocate their investment, and make sure that that investment is focused on areas which really do produce a return. And that was the substance of the debate on the climate change. So let me turn to the topic of this brief intervention, the globalization link of inflation. This is a link that was made, I think, by policymakers before it was made by academics. I mean, obviously, the Mello Pradhan and Charles Goodhart book is a nice statement of something, but it wasn't really an academic view. But Alan Greenspan, in the middle of the 2000s, in this nice environment, talked about it like this: because of deregulation, increased innovation, lower barriers to trade and investment, cross-border trade in recent decades has been expanding at a far faster pace than GDP. As a result, many economies are increasingly exposed to the rigors of international competition and comparative advantage. In the process, lower goods prices for some goods and services produced by our trading partners have completely suppressed domestic price pressures. And so I think this is by now a common sense viewpoint, but it took a long time for academics to take that on board. And somebody who's been mentioned a couple of times, Lawrence Ball, analyzed this very nicely in an early paper and asked 3 questions. Has globalization reduced the long-run level of inflation? Secondly, has it affected the structure of inflation dynamics, as summarized by the Phillips curve? And thirdly, has it contributed substantial negative shocks to the inflation process? So he was reacting to the kind of Greenspan sentiment. And in that paper, Lawrence Ball gave a really model example of how to do things succinctly. A short summary of the answers is no, no, and no. That was the academic consensus, but it rested on something which I think is peculiar, and that is that it rested on an identification of when globalization began that was common in the discussions in the 2000s, and said globalization began when China was admitted to the WTO in 2001 or so. But I don't think that's correct. And I wanted to look at this broader run of historical development. And if you look at the broader run, it seems to me that the answers to that question, or that series of questions that Lawrence Ball posed about inflation, is yes, yes, and yes, that globalization has a big impact on inflation. But I want to show you exactly what that impact is. So you can see, this is the, from Katao and Opsveld, but there are many, many versions of this around. It's I think, familiar, the story of globalization as the share of goods, or goods and services, of world output since the middle of the 19th century. And you can see in that there are 2 substantial phases when globalization took an uptake. And those phases are in the middle of the 19th century and then in the 1970s. And so I think it's particularly appropriate that a lot of this inflation discussion and the policy discussion of today focuses back on looking at the 1970s. But it may also be worth thinking of the middle of the 19th century, what pushed the world to globalization. And so some people say it's about technology, but the technology that globalized the world in the middle of the 19th century was there for a long time already. It's the steamship that opens up the continents that opens up, steam engines open up the railroads and open up the interiors of the continents. So the steamship is transformative, the steam engine is transformative, but the steam engine, after all, the initial discoveries, the tinkering by Boulton and Watt is in the 1770s. So, you know, how does that explain what happens in the middle of the 19th century? Well, in the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, you suddenly realize that you need to use it. Or the container ship. The container ship was transformative in the 1970s, and it's containerization that pushes the globalization of the late 20th century. But the first container ship had been launched in 1931. And there was a container shipping line already between the United States and Britain in the 1950s, but it just was trivial in its amount, and it's only in the 1970s that this picks up. So I think you need to think of what happens in a kind of you know, intellectual setting, political setting in the middle of the 19th century. And the story is a story of shortages, big shortages. So, you know, our first lesson of the story of globalization is that supply shocks in the middle of the 19th century or in the 1970s produce a very different reaction than the demand shocks of the Great Depression or the global financial crisis in 2008. And the 1840s, the supply shock, I mean, I think it's, you know, for many people, it's just visualized through the potato. And the most dramatic place where this supply shortage occurred was in Ireland, with massive deaths, deaths from famine, deaths from epidemic disease, typhus, then cholera came to Europe. But the potato epidemic, the potato failure and the famine was not just an Irish phenomenon. The potato failed in the Netherlands and Belgium. There were crop failures all over Europe. And what it did, what this story did, was to really push home the idea that Europe needed to feed itself outside of Europe, and it needed access to more resources, it needed more trade. But it also needed competent government, and the governments of the 1840s were extremely incompetent. There's then, you know this, I think, sitting in Vienna very well. There's a revolution in 1840 right across the European continent. The old incompetent governments are swept away, and there are new governments that try to organize things differently in the 1850s and 1860s. So there's also financial innovation. The new model of the universal bank that was started in Belgium and applied very tentatively in France in the 1840s gets generalized in the 1850s. So the crisis, the supply shock, creates all kinds of innovative responses. So this is just the story of the two waves of globalization, the first from the middle of the 19th century and the second from the 1970s. But let's look a bit at the story of inflation and asset prices in the mid-19th century episode. You can see, I think, a kind of transition. The immediate aftermath of the shock, of the supply shock, produces the kind of whiplash effects that some people were looking at in the COVID crisis, that the initial impact is deflationary, but then there's a sharp uptake in inflation, there's a boom in asset prices. It's that is producing the kind of innovation that you got in the 1850s. And then afterwards, gradually, in the later period, and then more after the 1870s, you settle down to a world in which there's much less inflation, much greater stability, and much less volatility of asset prices. And so this is actually a kind of experiment of the light at the end of the tunnel effect that the world actually went through in the middle of the 19th century. And if you lived in Vienna in 1848 or 1849, you must have thought, yes, indeed, this was it was a Zeitenwende. It was a big shift. But what comes is then, at the end of it, price stability, but in the middle, a period in which, even with the gold standard regime, there's a movement of sharp movement of prices. And this is the story of the taming of that process in the whole of the 19th century. So let me then turn briefly to the 1970s. Again, obviously a supply shock with the oil price increases of 1973, and then the second oil price shock in 1979. But it's important, I think, to think where this comes from. And it comes from a world in which there was also really rather odd thinking about the way in which you can deal with these crises. So it came after a big upsurge of global demand, synchronized world expansion in the late 60s and early 1970s that put pressure on the commodity prices. And then commodity price producers realized that they could use the power that they got through the rise in commodity prices to try to put a political blackmail on the world. And I think if you want to make the connection to today, you can actually see that too, that the rise in energy prices in the aftermath of the shortages that the COVID pandemic generated, that rise in the energy prices gives at least one big energy exporter, Russia, the idea that it can use the energy strategically to blackmail and to get what it wants. But it's also, in the 1970s, at first the reaction to the 1970s is, this is a terribly dangerous world. We need to protect ourselves more. We need to develop our own resources, and particularly in Cambridge, particularly at the moment that I was studying, the Department of Applied Economics under Wynne Godley in Cambridge was very much pushing this idea of having domestically focused growth as a way of overcoming the problem and supplying everything domestically. So the idea of friendshoring, which is in the air at the moment, you heard, I think, Secretary Yellen, the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, talking about this a few weeks ago. But that idea was in the world in the 1970s, and the initial reaction was more protectionism. And it's really only gradually that you can see the downsides of that attempt to do protectionism and the idea that the world is better as an open economy. The Phillips curve, we've had a substantial discussion of the Phillips curve. I don't really want to say any more about the Phillips curve. You've really heard enough about it. But the story of it is that the Phillips curve didn't look as if it was behaving right in the 1970s, and then it behaves in a different way in the globalization period in the 1990s. And so some people think that the Phillips curve is dead. We've heard that idea being discussed. But the important thing, I think, is that the Phillips curve is about big aggregates. It's got the notion of what's the availability of a big pool of unemployed people does to the labor market, to the supply of labor. And so if there's a shortage of labor, that gives you the opportunity to push up the wage costs. But it doesn't really deal at all with the issue that you get in moments of great structural change, which is that you can have big labor surpluses in some areas, in some kinds of skills, but big shortages in other areas, and that you don't find the automatic transition from one to the other. And so that's, I think, why the story of looking at microdata is so important. Well, part of the story of the 1970s is also that different countries adjusted in different ways. And so some countries adjusted more quickly, and some countries delayed the adjustment. So the UK or the United States were really quite slow in adjusting to inflation. And the consequence of that is that when they adjust in the end, it becomes much more painful. It's a much more difficult exercise. And it's also, I think, a story that where you got the adjustment and where you let the prices signal what was the appropriate action. In Germany, in particular, in the 1970s, you got a very quick move to more fuel economy, more energy efficiency, where you didn't have that in the United States, where instead you used subsidies for a long time to keep energy prices down. You had Americans driving gas guzzlers right until the end of the 1970s, and then the American automobile industry was wiped out because it hadn't had the price signals that allowed it to do the adjustment. You might say, well, do supply shortages necessarily produce inflation? No, of course they don't. But if you want to think about the mechanisms, then I think you need to think of these three kind of features of inflation that have in the past historically pushed inflation. Fiscal dominance, when you're so worried about the ability to finance government debt, large-scale government debt, that it exercises a big impact on the central bank. There's a big political push that the central bank, in a world of fiscal dominance, has to keep the interest rates down in order to allow the state to continue to exist. Financial dominance, where there's a big financial system which is also addicted to low interest rates and where a move to tighten policy would threaten a financial crisis. And so you have then also a move to delay the adjustment. And finally, I think a kind of more political science argument about why inflation occurs, that there's a social dominance, what we might call a social dominance, where people say you need the inflation in order to buy a social peace. You need to, it's an easy way of buying off competing unions or competing employer interests, and you get social peace. It was a common argument that was made in the 1970s. There was a book on that by Fred Hirsch and John Goldthorpe. So that all these views, I think all these structures shift the politics in favor of an inflationary solution for one moment, but then you gradually realize the costs of the inflationary exercise. And each of these inflationary exercises is then followed by a world in which there's a return to some sort of monetary policy that looks for a stable and internationally valid system to keep the prices and the expectations more manageable and more controllable. It's the gold standard in the 19th century. In the late 19th century, country after country goes on to the gold standard from the 1870s. It's the inflation targeting regime at the end of the 20th century. So this is the world where there's the deglobalization challenge, and the arguments that you have in this setting look like arguments from the past, that debt management becomes important when you're worried about security, and national security becomes a big argument. And so in the early 1920s in Germany, the central bank again and again emphasized that it was doing its patriotic duty in keeping the inflation going. And the president of the central bank, Rudolf Hauenstein, made speech after speech in which he boasted about the additional printing presses that they just opened up, the additional plates that they got to print the German notes, all for a patriotic purpose. In the 1950s, at the height of the great conflict between the Federal Reserve and the US government, President Eisenhower summoned in the bankers, the members of the Open Market Committee, and told them that this was their patriotic duty to keep the debt of the United States affordable. But in that setting, there's still, I think, a question, and so I would like right at the end to come back to the original consensus idea that inflation is dangerous. And we've got, I think, a different world from the 1970s and a different world from the middle of the 19th century. We've got private monies as an alternative. We've got a question about whether central banks provide digital currencies, their own digital currencies. There will be a demand for stability, and a demand for stability that often the private sector can't answer on its own. And the private monies, I think, if you just allow me one little reflection on the private monies, in the 1970s, different countries adopted different inflation regimes. So Germany had a different inflation regime to France or Italy or the UK. It's conceivable that you could have a world that's separated into optimal digital currency areas where people with a kind of low inflation expectation will have their own digital currency. And there are discussions of this. Perhaps you might say they're not that serious, but there are Republicans in the United States who say that they want to have a MAGA coin, Make America Great coin, Make America Great Again coin, a MAGA coin that will offer an alternative to inflation and will offer a more stable currency. And you can imagine other political groups having their own currencies. Well, that's a world of fragmentation. It's the version of deglobalization. It's also a world, I think, that needs to be avoided. And so that's what central banks, I think, will have to think about. Let me just finish with the bottom line. Higher inflation in these moments of potential shocks, of supply shocks, higher inflation shouldn't be interpreted as a sign that globalization is on the retreat, although it may be interpreted in that way by many people. It's rather an indication, and that's how it was used productively in the middle of the 19th century and in the 1970s again, to say that more globalization, more internationalization is needed. And I would even go beyond this and say, for me, this is an indication that more globalization is actually likely now. It's needed and likely. So I also see the light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Well, so thank you very much for this trip back 200 years in time. I guess we have some 5 minutes or so for questions and discussion. David Marsh.
Yes, thank you very much, Harold. I just thought about a couple of other differences compared with the past. One is, of course, the kind of Twitterization of the world and the way that messages flash around the world very quickly. And then you mentioned people feeling conspiracy theories. We remember when Mr. Schäuble said about Mr. Draghi that half the people voting for AfD were because of QE, for example. Do you think that inequality, or it's not so much that we have inequality, it's just people know about inequality these days. Do you think this is going to make the mastering of inflation all the more difficult? And also the fact that central banks are better known these days. Nobody used to put Leslie O'Brien or Gordon Richardson onto the front page of the Daily Mail, whereas they do with Andrew Bailey. And they have pictures of Madame Lagarde in her Hermes scarf in the Bild Zeitung saying, Madame Inflation. The fact that central banks are better known these days, does that also mean that they've made a rod for their own backs in some way?
Should I answer that question? I think probably, yes. I mean, not. Yes, David, you're right that there are lots of conspiracy theories, but that's the point of having historians, that they know that conspiracy theories are very, very old. There were lots of conspiracy theories in the 1840s. They drove the story of the revolution. There were lots of conspiracy stories in the 1970s. I mean, maybe central banks were not always the target there, although actually the governor of the Bank of England in 1847 had to be dismissed because he had been engaged in a business venture that failed in the big wave of failures in the commercial collapse of the 1840s, in 1847. I think we're right to be worried about conspiracy theories, but conspiracy theories are not new, and inequality is not new, and the sight of the amazing privilege when millions of people are starving in Ireland is surely a more offensive version of inequality even than anything that we have now. And the 1970s, I mean, you might remember how the British Prime Minister, Edward Heath, discusses Tiny Rowland as the unpleasant and unacceptable face of capitalism. There were capitalist tycoons who were doing bad things in the 1970s, and they're doing bad things today. Nothing is new in the world, and maybe we should also look past those conspiracy theories and the legitimate concern to see how they can actually be improved or dealt with. And what happens then is that you can have genuine growth. That if you think of the world in the 1970s, this was a world in which there were a large portion of the world was on the border of starvation, and the globalization surge after that substantially reduced inequality on a global level.
Any further questions? Maybe I would like to ask a last one. You closed on your closing slide, you said that basically made a normative statement that more globalization is needed, and then you said that you'd also expect that to happen. But you've also worked on a number of periods which saw significant deglobalization. So what do you think are the factors that would push for globalization this time?
I mean, deglobalization periods are associated, I think, historically with great conflicts and great destruction, and it's part of the learning process after the Great Depression that there's a need to construct the world in a different way, and I think one point that I may have put less emphasis on than I should have done is that each of these globalization periods is quite different. So the globalization of the late 19th century is different to the globalization of the late 20th century. And if you think that there's going to be a new globalization, it's not going to be the kind of globalization that's based on the worldwide spread of manufacturing that was the feature of the globalization of the late 20th century, the early 21st century, and is, I think, best embodied in the idea of the China shock after 2001. But the globalization of the future is going to be about electronic communications, about the application of artificial intelligence. It's going to be much more a globalization of services. I mean, you've seen how you can have a conference here that globalizes the world, with technology, that we don't all need to fly to Vienna, although it was very good to fly to Vienna. But this will be a different globalization than the globalization of the past. So we're not going to do a retread of the 1980s and 1990s in the same way that the 1980s and 90s were not a retread of 19th century globalization, which was much more about getting food and commodity production across the world in exchange for European and American manufacturers.
Well, okay, so thank you very much. So I would say that we are very happy that we still kept with the old style globalization, that you actually came to Vienna in person. So thanks again for the lecture, Harold, and
thank you, Clemens. Thanks.
So and I will hand over to the Secretary General of SUERF, Ernest Gnan, for the prizes.
Ladies and gentlemen, we now proceed to the best kept secret of this whole conference, namely the award of this year's SUERF Marjolin Award. Today, SUERF is happy to award the 17th Marjolin Prize to the best paper of the conference by an economist under the age of 40. A distinguished jury of 6 senior academic and central bankers among SUERF's Council of Management has carefully evaluated the submissions to a call for papers, which yielded 50 submissions. The jury identified a number of excellent submissions, many of which you had the pleasure of listening to this morning. After careful consideration, and we really didn't make the choice an easy one for us, the jury identified the paper which should receive the 2020 SUERF Marjolin Award. And the winner is Alistair Macaulay with his paper on heterogeneous information, subjective model beliefs, and the time-varying transmission of shocks. Alistair, please come to me, join me at the stage. Now, just to illustrate for you, the paper that Alistair got the prize for is almost half a book. So it's really a big achievement that you made here, but it's also a big achievement for the 6 members of the jury to have really plowed through this. And we appreciated the paper very much in all its detail and in its sophistication. Indeed, the jury praised the innovative choice of the topic, the excellent technical execution of the paper. We had a little bit of a taste this morning, just a tiny fraction, and the very high policy relevance of the findings. Dear Alistair, wholehearted congratulations for your brilliant paper and for the SUERF 2020 Marjolin Award. I have the great pleasure of handing over this heavy frame with your Urkunde, with your, how do you say this document? This is a spare copy if you break the other one. Before I hand over to you for a brief presentation of your paper, I'm sure that you can do this ad hoc, without any preparation, which also, by the way, appears today as a SUERF policy brief. If our coordination works well, it should happen this very second that it's published and that a tweet is posted on the World Wide Web. A few words of introduction to the audience. You are a postdoctoral junior research fellow. I cannot actually believe that it's junior, it must be senior research fellow at the University of Oxford, from where you also received your PhD last year, I understand. You're also a visiting lecturer at King's College London. Your research interests, as we have already tasted a little bit, include macroeconomics and information economics, with a particular focus on the drivers and implications of heterogeneity in expectations formation. Just for those interested here among you, Alistair will be on the job market in 2022, 2023. I understood why this is only going to be in the coming fall. Actually, it should have been 2 years ago, but then COVID came in between, and you actually preferred to stay in the nice and secure buildings of Oxford University. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Alistair, for your presentation.
Yeah, Thank you, Ernest. And I should say thank you, and maybe I should apologize for the length of the paper. That I'm very grateful that you trawled through all 80 pages or however long it is. I think I should also start by actually thanking all of the organizers, and particularly Ernest, for putting on the academic session this morning and for picking my paper to be on it. It's been an absolute privilege to be here over the past 2 days. I've learned an awful lot, and it's been great fun. And also the exercise of distilling 80 pages into a 10-minute talk this morning was an extremely useful intellectual device, as well as everything else. To win this prize from among a brilliant set of papers and presentations this morning it's an incredible honor. I'm incredibly flattered. And yeah, thank you very much for that. I know many of you were here for the academic session this morning, so maybe what I'll do in this time is I'll give a very brief refresher of the key ideas that I was trying to get at. And then I'll, if I can, expand a little bit more on some of the policy implications. So the key starting point for the paper, as we heard many times this morning, was that expectations of a whole range of different variables tend to be extremely heterogeneous. People disagree about the future evolution of the world. And the key idea in my paper was that actually it might be useful to try and dig a layer deeper and understand heterogeneity and differences in the information and the subjective models of the world that underlie those expectations and that therefore go into creating that disagreement in the first place. And the reason that that's important is that correlations across people in those two components of expectations can have a really important effect on the way macroeconomic shocks transmit through the economy. So a shock that increases inflation will have a much larger negative effect on aggregate consumption and aggregate demand if the information about that shock and about inflation is concentrated among people who believe that increases in inflation have really terrible effects on the macroeconomy going forward. And indeed, that's precisely what we saw in some survey data on UK household beliefs from the Bank of England. But the other thing we saw in that data was that actually that correlation between information and subjective models, it moves around over time. And so I had that simulation that was looking at what happens when there's a spike in inflation in this kind of environment. And we had that difficult group of households who start out believing that inflation makes the economy stronger. And the reason they're difficult is that this shock that increases inflation, like we're seeing at the moment, has the potential to push those households towards the view that actually, on balance, inflation doesn't matter as much. And that's a problem because they're going to then stop paying attention to inflation. And so even if you as policymakers and central bankers manage to bring inflation back down to target, the expectations of those households are not going to come with you because they're no longer paying attention and no longer observing inflation. Now, this morning, when I talked about that, I had a question about, does this mean that central banks should be more aggressive in fighting inflation? And I'll admit now that the answer I gave was maybe only half an answer. So what I said was, well, sure, this is an extra risk that I've identified associated with what happens if inflation gets too high. There's a risk that you lose this difficult group of households, and then it's very difficult to bring them back down. And so that means you should fight high inflation more aggressively. But there's another slightly more nuanced thing going on, which is that in that situation, what happens is we take a group of households who were reasonably well informed about inflation and thought inflation was good for the economy, and we've pushed them into being uninformed. And so the implication of that is that we're going to strengthen this concentration of information about inflation among the people who believe inflation is really terrible for the wider economy. And so that means future increases in inflation will be met with more negative responses in aggregate consumption. And that drag on aggregate consumption will act as a brake on those future inflation rises. So although this effect suggests that you should be more worried about inflation rising to high levels, it also implies that actually you might not need to be as aggressive in changing monetary policy, interest rates, quantitative easing, in order to bring inflation back down because you've got the help, in a way, of this narrative heterogeneity channel, as I called it. So there's a slight nuance there, and I think the main lesson that I would take from all of that is, perhaps unsurprisingly as an academic, is a call for more data. Because if we want to understand this effect, this heterogeneity channel, and we want to understand, okay, how is this going to affect inflation or policy going forward, we need to understand not just what are household or firm expectations of inflation or other variables. We also need to understand where those are coming from to understand the information and the subjective models that go into those. Partly for that narrative heterogeneity effect, also for a simpler reason, which is that I've identified who the problem households are, who the difficult households are in terms of expectations becoming stuck at high levels. I was able in quite a rough and coarse way to identify who those households are in that Bank of England survey. But there are lots more detailed things we'd like to know about information and subjective models to understand these channels better. And we'd like to know who these households are in other countries. And we'd like to know if there are firms that have similar beliefs. And as far as I'm aware, there's no current way in survey data or using other methods to identify that group of people. So I think my main policy implication that I'd end on is a plea that we need to understand more about how these expectations are formed, what the different components are, and measure those at a household or a firm level. With that, yeah, I'll wrap up there. Thank you again, Ernest and everyone else. Yeah, it's been great.
Thanks again. Warm congratulations. Thank you. To digest all this after lunch intellectual food for thought, may I invite you for another coffee break? Please be back at 3:45 sharp for the final session 4 on microprice data and inflation analysis. Thank you very much.